Stanford University.
Hi, my name is Andy DiPaolo. I'm the Executive Director Emeritus of the Stanford Center for Professional Development, and I'm delighted today to be doing the oral history of Channing Robertson, who's an Emeritus Professor of Chemical Engineering at Stanford. And I thought I'd first start this interview by going back and reflecting on something I read when Channing won the 2009 Dinkelspiel Award, which is Stanford's highest honor for contributions to undergraduate education. So I went back and I read the citation, and there's some terrific things here, and I extracted a few. And in the citation it said that Channing was first a master educator and mentor and must-have advisor to nearly 4 decades of students. And then second, he was recognized for teaching students to consider the science they learn in the broader context of the economic and regulatory environment. And third, for his pivotal role in several major educational initiatives, including the development of bioX and bioengineering. But the one I liked best was the award also recognized his creativity and gifted storytelling. I've known Channing for many years. I can assure you that I think today Channing will share his storytelling skills as we begin to work through a series of questions about his experiences, accomplishments, and challenges while you're at Stanford. So welcome, Channing. I'm delighted to be spending time with you today.
Thank you for having me.
I always like to start with a question about your early experiences, even before you came to Stanford. Maybe you could reflect a bit on your childhood, your interests, your family, that got you up to being admitted to Berkeley and going through the program there.
So I was born in Los Angeles and was raised in my early years through kindergarten in a set of very poor conditions. My mother and father and grandmother and brother and sister lived in a one-room, well, it was just a room on top of a garage behind a doctor's house. And there was a metal box in the corner, which was the shower, which drained out onto the driveway. But not having experienced much else, I thought that's just the way you lived. And my mother's Czech, and my father is Scottish, hence the Robertson name. And they met in Nebraska. My dad was a civil engineer. He didn't finish at the University of Nebraska. It was interrupted by his having won a contest in 1936 of having guessed some football scores for the Big Ten football teams, and he and my mother won a trip to the Rose Bowl that year. So they got on a train in Omaha, came to the Rose Bowl, looked around Los Angeles, and actually never went back. Wow. So I suppose I could have been a Cornhusker had it not been for the Rose Bowl. And my dad got a job as the chief surveyor on the construction of the Metropolitan Water District Aqueduct, which was bringing water from the Colorado River to Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles had its own aqueduct coming from the Owens Valley, but the surrounding cities that were proliferating at that time also needed water, and the city of Los Angeles wasn't about to share it, so they built their own aqueduct. And when that was completed, they were living in Banning, California at the time, which was the midway between Los Angeles and the Colorado River. And then they moved to Los Angeles, and my dad started working for the Department of Water and Power, and as a designer of dams. And he and a fellow by the name of Proctor helped to perfect this earth compaction technique that uses a thing called the sheepfoot's tramper, which is this big roller with spikes on it, which compacts earth to the point where you can actually use it to build dams with. And that revolutionized both the cost and the location possibilities for dams. But my dad was a civil servant and wasn't very good at passing any of the tests, so he never advanced very high in rank, although he was given a high degree of responsibility, but didn't make much money. My mother sold shoes at the May Company in Los Angeles, and in that was probably about 1948 or 49, we moved to Glendale, California. And they found a small house located near a collection of an elementary school and a junior high school and a high school, which was literally 4 houses from where I lived. So I went to all 3 of those. And you know, as I moved through the school system in those days, they would call out students who, it's hard to say, I guess, seemed to do better than others, and grafted them together and yielded them into a group. So I went through with a group of kids starting in first grade, essentially all the way through high school. A group of friends that I'm still very close to. It's pretty amazing. We're in contact with one another, even though we graduated 60 years ago from high school. But it was a lifelong bond, and I developed an interest in science, I think, early on, with my first real science class in junior high school. I had a very, very good science teacher, Mr. Pack. I'll never forget him. And he took a bunch of us to Yosemite. He was a ranger in the summer. And so he took a bunch of us to Yosemite during the summer. And that's where I developed a passion for hiking and rock climbing. And then I had a very good chemistry teacher. Remember Mrs. Jordan? I always tell students, I said, you always remember fondly your best teachers, but you probably can't remember a lot about exactly what they taught you. But there's something a bond you developed with them in a way.
You're absolutely right. Right.
And I presume I learned chemistry from Miss Jordan. I learned biology from Mr. Pack, but I couldn't tell you exactly.
Was your dad, as an engineer, an influence in you thinking about engineering?
No. No, he was very introverted. Never talked much. My mother ran the family. My grandmother didn't speak English, so I ended up speaking Czech as well as, in fact, I would say that was probably my first language when I went to kindergarten. And, my mother told me the story in later years that when I went to kindergarten, kids were all sitting in a circle and the teacher was asking them their names. And later, after I came back from school, my mother got a phone call from the teacher and says, your son doesn't seem to know his name. And she says, well, what did he say? And she said something like, Jesus Maria. Well, I thought that was my name because that's what my grandmother always used to yell at me. But in Czech, it means Jesus Christ.
That's pretty good.
So
you progressed through elementary and high school, and then what got you thinking about going to Berkeley for engineering or elsewhere?
I actually didn't think about going to Berkeley. I knew this group of kids that I had been aggregated with were all talking about going to college, but I didn't get any encouragement or advice from my parents because neither of them had completed college. My mother had never gone, my dad never finished. And my sister didn't go, my older sister didn't go to college, and my younger brother never went to college. So education was not a high priority, if you will, and it wasn't coveted in some way.
Right.
And I had a high school counselor, and she was the one that said, you know, I ought to consider going to university. And talking with my friends, everybody wanted to go to UCLA or USC because
Local
that's all
schools.
I knew. I had never been on an airplane. I had never really been out of the Los Angeles area, at least as far as you could drive, and up through high school. So my world was the beaches where I would surf, and Los Angeles, where I could get to Los Angeles on the red car, which is a streetcar that no longer exists. And I spent my summers in high school working for the Department of Water and Power, taking water samples from reservoirs and returning them back to, I thought that was a pretty good job, because my other job was working in a liquor store and delivering liquor to little old ladies all over town in paper bags, and it wasn't exactly rewarding, but it was a job. And so this high school counselor, you know, suggested, you know, that I apply. And when I told my mother, UCLA, or she says no. She says, you're not going to either one of those places. And I said, why? She says, well, because, you know, you just spend all your time at the beach. I always have these truant officers calling me because you don't show up at high school, and you're going to do the same thing. It'd be a waste of money. So there was a scholarship society that I was in, and they took a field trip, and the field trip was to go see Berkeley and Stanford. And I didn't even know where they were. I didn't know where Berkeley was. I didn't know where Stanford was, and I actually didn't know much about either place. And so I took the SATs, which was somewhat of a disaster, because I had to go up to Occidental College in Eagle Rock, and I remember my mother waking me up and saying, you've got to take this number 2 pencil and get on the bus and go take this test. And I said, I don't want to take a test. And she says, no, you have to go take this test. Your counselor says you need to take this test. And this wasn't as it is today. No studying for it, no you know, Princeton reviews or any of this stuff. And about 11:30 in the morning, I was getting bored, you know, filling in these, and my pencil broke. So I got up and left and got on the bus and came home. And so I probably completed maybe half the test.
Really?
And yeah, I didn't think much of it. And then I got this big envelope from Stanford, and I had been admitted. And I went out. I remember my dad was weeding the front lawn, and I went out and I said, look, I've been admitted to Stanford. They've given me a scholarship. They're going to pay everything. And he didn't even look up. It just didn't matter to him. Or my mother's reaction was, don't tell your brother or sister, because then they'll feel badly. You know, so I just took it. And then about a week later, another envelope came from Berkeley, and I had been admitted to Berkeley, and I had been chosen as a Regents Scholar. And that covers, in those days, it covered your tuition, which wasn't much. I should tell you, not much. Stanford's tuition at that time was $525 a quarter. So Berkeley was essentially free, but it also covered room and board and books for 4 years. And all you had to do was keep a 3.0 B average for every semester. They were on the semester system at the time. And I didn't really know which place I wanted to go, but I did talk to this small group. They were also getting into colleges and universities. And many of them had applied to Stanford, and none of them had gotten in. And there was a group of about 5 other of my male friends who had gotten into Berkeley. So I decided I'd go to Berkeley because I wanted to be with my friends. And I didn't have a distinction between Berkeley or Stanford, or really, I mean, I had visited them, but I really wasn't.
Did you have any kind of career path in mind, or just to go and explore?
Yeah, no, I didn't. Well, I knew I liked science, and I liked chemistry, but I had done well in math and physics, but also I loved English, and I loved writing, and I was in public speaking, and there really wasn't anything I didn't like. The only thing I didn't like was swimming the 200-yard butterfly on the swim team. That was pretty gruesome, but I only did that because I liked playing water polo, and you had to be on the swim team to be on the water polo team. So we trudged off to Berkeley. There were 6 of us. Our mothers had found a house right off Telegraph Avenue on Hay Street, which is about 3 blocks from Durant, which is the border of the campus. And it was a rooming house run by Mrs. Noyes, N-O-Y-E-S. We called her Mrs. Noyes. She was crippled, and this was probably a 4-story Victorian house, and she couldn't go up the stairs, but she had a place at the bottom, and she'd let us know she was around. She'd yell a lot at us because she could hear what we were doing upstairs, basically dismantling the place and tearing it apart and having water fights. Well, we each had a little room, and we'd trudge up Telegraph Avenue, and first thing I found out when I showed up was that you go into the gymnasium and you get a card, and at that point I had declared engineering because I didn't want to declare a science major like biology or chemistry, and I felt that was too narrow. So I figured engineering would give me some way to move around, and I've always liked how things work. So, but I didn't realize that what that meant in those days is that you became somewhat of a pariah among students. Engineering had its own curriculum, had its own math sequence, its own physics sequence, and you were immediately put into it. So I immediately started out with physics, which was great because I had Edward Teller.
So you,
professor of physics.
So you had to declare as a freshman what your major was?
You did then,
right?
But the other thing that happened is I saw that I was in ROTC, but I hadn't signed up for that. So I told them I didn't want to be in ROTC. This was 1961, fall of 61. And I didn't harbor any bad feelings about ROTC. I just didn't, it wasn't in my plan to. And then they said, well, for people who don't want to be in, you have to go see this commander or somebody. And the guy said, people who don't like that really, you probably don't want to be in the Army, but we can offer you a Navy ROTC or an Air Force ROTC. But when you graduate, you have to serve 3 or 5 years or something. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in the thing at all. And I don't want to do it. So we have to, because this is a land-grant college, and every land-grant college has an ROTC program, and all males who are fit have to serve in ROTC for 2 years. That's the law. And it was the law. So then I talked to some of the other kids I'd gone up there with, some of the other guys, and one guy was a drummer, and one guy played a trombone, another guy played a clarinet, because at that high school we went to, music was a big, if you were musically talented at all, you could engage in learning an instrument. So they had all gotten in the Army band, and to be in the Army band, you were treated differently than in terms of the marching and the stuff that you had to do. So I went and tried to get in the band, but all I played was the piano and the accordion, and they didn't want either one of them in the band. So
tough to march with that.
I lost out. And so I spent 2 years, and what that meant was 2 days a week we had to wear uniforms onto campus. And then march in the afternoons, and then people in the military from Treasure Island, which was active at the time, would come over and watch. I ended up getting kicked out of ROTC for destroying government property. We were given rifles and told to go into the women's gym and shoot at targets, and we decided to shoot out all the lights in the windows, and we actually had a small, which wasn't greatly appreciated. And so I got enough demerits to get kicked out. So I got, in the end, I got 4 units of F for my first 4 semesters of F for my first 4.
And no obligation to serve.
No, they didn't really. I don't think they really wanted me. I don't think they viewed me as real positive material. So
how did you go from broad-based engineering and sort of zero in on chemical engineering?
Well, I found out I was actually had to pick a major within engineering, and in the first semester I was there, I didn't realize I had to do that either. So I picked civil because that was what my dad was.
Right.
That's the only thing I knew.
Right.
And so I took the first course in civil engineering, which was a surveying course. And I actually had done surveying. I had worked, when I wasn't working at the Water and Power in the summers, I was working for what was then called the California Division of Highways, which later became Caltrans. And they were building the 134 freeway from what is the 5 across through into Pasadena through Glendale. And so I was on what's called a chain crew. We had a theodolite, we had a transom, we had a plumb bob, and we had a tape measure, and that's how you would decide how the freeway would be graded. But I had 3 lunatics as my partners on this in this surveying class who weren't very bright, and at the end of the semester, we had serious trouble. We would start at a fire hydrant on campus, and you walk all around campus, and you come back, and we always found the fire hydrant, 500 feet below the ground, and it was supposed to be, everything was supposed to close. And so I flunked that class, and I figured, well, I guess civil engineering isn't for me. And I also got a C in calculus. And since my GPA was below 3.0, they took away my Regents scholarship. And so I remember calling my mother, and I said, I've lost all this. I don't. And her reaction was, get a job. Because there wasn't any money coming from that.
Drop out of school and get a job, or just get a second job to pay for it.
Yeah, just get a job on campus somewhere. And I didn't want to do that. So I went to the library, and I started digging into the land of obscure scholarships. And I found scholarships that very few people applied to, that were out there, like from realtors or Kiwanis, Rotary, even the American Water Works Association. So I would manage to get a scholarship for every semester to pay my way. I figured that was working, getting them, and then I didn't really have to work, and then I would work at it again to get another one. And so I bootstrapped my way through. So I went in to see a counselor, college counselor at Berkeley, and I said, well, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I remember she was, it's just one of those things. You find a person that says all the right things to you. And she extracted that chemistry was something I liked. I liked how molecules fit together and combine to make things. And I said, I really don't want to be a chemist. And she says, well, we have this major called chemical engineering, where you combine engineering with chemistry. And I said, well, that sounds pretty good to me.
Yep.
And just about that time, I came back home one day to our little Victorian, and it was all, there was a coroner there and police, and what's going on? And they said, well, have you seen your landlady? I said, we never saw much of her. And anyway, and we would put the checks under her door, $35 a month to live in this boarding house. Well, she's passed away. And I said, well, it's too bad. And he says, it looks like she's been dead for about 3 months.
Oh, no.
And this horrible stench was coming out. And so the TV was still on, but it was just a little dot and burned out. And so her son had come to visit her and found her, and we never noticed. We never paid any attention. We just pass in and out of the place. So anyway, the health department closed the place down. So I said, where are we going to live? And then we have to go to the housing office. So we went to the housing office, and this was the end of the first semester, and kids would flunk out, and housing spots would open, and the housing office would know. And so I got stuck in one of the dormitories, Deutsch Hall at Berkeley, with a guy whose roommate had flunked out. And this person that I was paired up with was a guy named George Holmesy. You know Bud Holmesy.
Yeah, Bud Holmesy, sure. Yeah.
And although you and I know.
You should mention Bud Holmesy is because people won't know who he is.
So
yes.
Bud Holmesy was a engineering student, and turned out to be an engineering student in chemical engineering at Berkeley, and I was paired up with him. And as fate may have it, we went through chemical engineering at Berkeley together, and then we went off to different graduate schools. And we were both hired independently the same year onto the faculty here at Stanford.
Right.
And and the faculty had no idea we knew each other, much less had roomed together for nearly 4 years.
I want to come back to Bud later on about what was going on in the department at that time.
So that was one of these sort of strange coincidences in life, and we had we were really paired well, because he slept all day and was up all night working, and I slept at night and worked all day. So we actually got rid of one of the beds in the room. We got in a fair amount of trouble because we were on the 8th floor of this building, and Bud's way of getting rid of the bed was he threw it out the window. And luckily it didn't land on anybody, but when they found it and traced it back to our room, then of course we said we have no idea how the bed could end up 8 stories below, but by the way, we don't want it back. And so we had one desk and one bed, and we shared that, and that worked out well. The only thing I had to do, my one obligation, was to get him out of bed during the day when we had tests, because then he had to. But we were always cutting corners. We took quantitative chemistry together, which is in those days was taught by one of the older crusty chemistry profs, and there were only men. There weren't any women in the chemical engineering major, at least none that we knew of. And we take this class, and the prof says, okay, I'm going to give you one unknown a week. So that's 15 weeks in the semester system, 15 unknowns. Or if you want, I'll give you the super unknown, one unknown, and you'll have 15 weeks to work on it. Bud and I looked at each other. Let's take the super unknown. And so all these other guys pick the 15 unknowns. They get these little 15 vials with white powder or yellow powder, in it. And the guy says, okay, the two of you want the super unknown? I said, yeah. Mm-hmm. And he gives us this bowl that has a cardboard thing over the top. You look at it, and in it was just this nasty, black, stinking goo. And he says, that's a super unknown. So, okay, whatever, we'll figure it out. So we put it on our desk, the desk we shared. So in the 14th week of the semester, I said, you know, Bud, we ought to do something about this unknown, because our whole grade hinges on this. And he says, I've been thinking about this. And I said, he says, I know what we're going to do. And so he takes a match out and he lights it and he throws it into this. And the match goes out. And he goes, darn, he said, you know, it's not magnesium. And I said,
it's a good thing.
You thought that was magnesium? And so we both got zeros and flunked that class. And this guy took great glee in flunking us. Because he thought he was going to really teach us a lesson. And so on it went. And
so let's keep going with this. So I want to get you to the Stanford portion of it. So you got a degree in chemical engineering, but then you made the transition to the farm, and you came here to work on an MS degree. Is that right? What got you to come here?
Well, as it was 1965, June of 1965 approached. We were in a war.
Right.
We were in the Vietnam War. And during my junior and senior year, I had been protesting, been tear gassed, had gone to, marched on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and I was in the North Hollywood draft board. They had draft boards in those days.
Yes.
And they didn't accept gays into the military then. And in that area of town, there was a large gay population, and so your chances of getting drafted out of the North Hollywood draft board were really high because the pool of eligible males was reduced almost by 30%.
Yeah, right.
And I didn't want to get drafted, and I didn't want to go. Two of my roommates, my senior year at Berkeley, were drafted and were killed. Both civil engineers, both Seabees, killed building an airstrip. And another fortuitous thing had happened. Two profs in chemical engineering at Berkeley, one Michel Boudard,
also from chemical engineering,
who was a chemical engineering at Stanford, right. But he was a chemical engineering prof at Berkeley then, and was my undergraduate advisor.
Oh.
So I knew him. And Andy Akravos was a professor at Berkeley, and of course I had class from him. David Mason, who started in the Stanford years, David Mason, who was a professor in applied chemistry at Stanford when he came from Caltech with another fellow by the name of Neil Pings. They were this outpost in the Stanford chemistry department that did applied things, and really weren't, I would say, appreciated for what they did. And Dave convinced, and of course they were in humanities and sciences. Dave made a proposition to the then dean of engineering. So there was Terman, and then there was Joe Pettit,
sure,
who later became president of Georgia Tech.
Right.
And that we should break off from chemistry and form a Department of Chemical Engineering within the School of Engineering. And that was acted upon favorably. And so Dave needed to build the department. He only had 3 people in the department. So he went and hired Boudard and Akravos from Berkeley, stole them, brought them down to Stanford. So the department almost doubled in size. And Boudard and Akravos were very much interested in a vision of developing a chemical engineering research program, a PhD program. There really wasn't one at the time. They had granted a few PhDs from this applied chemistry outfit, but they weren't on the map. The department wasn't on the map, and certainly the research program wasn't on the map. And I got a call from Acrovos asking me what my plans were after graduation. And he had come down to Stanford in 64, 63, 64, and this was 65 now. So he had been down at Stanford for a year or so. And he knew me. And I told him, well, I just didn't want to be drafted. It'd be great if I could keep my student deferment. He says, well, why don't you come down to graduate school at Stanford? And I said, but do I need to fill out anything? He says, no, just
show up.
You're in. So he built, Boudoir and Acrovos built the first class that came in the fall of '65, the first serious class of students who went on to get their PhDs, right. And many of them have made important marks in the field. It was a great class. I had no idea what to expect. The department was in a little building behind old chemistry, which
yes.
doesn't exist there anymore. It was a place that kept gas cylinders, and Boudoir had his office in there, and Mason had his office in there. There's another guy named Bill Schwartz who had his office in old chemistry, and Andy Acrovos had his office in the Peterson building up here, where material sciences. Right. And Bob Maddox had come because he was Michel Boudoir's graduate student, and so Michel knew him and brought him onto the faculty.
Oh, interesting.
And Bob's office was in McCullough. And Andy's student, he wanted to come but didn't, was Andy Grove. Andy Grove was a student of Andy's at Berkeley. And
who was your principal advisor?
Well, it started out, I chose Bill Schwartz because he was in non-Newtonian fluid mechanics, and I thought that sounded kind of interesting because that's sort of the motion of these fluids that don't behave in what's called a Newtonian way, so it's goos and slimes and so forth. And he was also interested in turbulence, and I thought turbulence was interesting. And so I started working with him, and after about 8 or 9 months, my work wasn't going anywhere. I could just see that this wasn't going to work out, and I wasn't very happy. And so I went to Dave Mason, who was the chair of the department. I said, Professor Mason, what do you think I should do? He says, well, go see if some other faculty will take you. So I went into Acrovos, and because he was doing fluid mechanics too, and Boudoir was doing catalysis, which I wasn't really interested in. And Acrovos said, fine, you can work with me. And he said, one of my students, who was about 2 years ahead of me, has developed this theory, and we need to actually experimentally verify it. So why don't you devise a way to experimentally verify this theory? And that was good because it distanced me a little bit from Andy, because he tended to pay pretty close attention to what you were doing, but laboratory skills weren't his strong point. So if you could get in the lab and do something, he'd come in and kind of wander around in amazement. But I just tell him things are going well. And so it took me about 3 years to build this device. And it took me about 2 weeks to collect the data. And that was it. And it all worked.
Was this then your dissertation?
This was my dissertation. I got a master's along the way, but it was a course master. So after 1 year, they gave you a master's degree. But so I finished in May of '69, and I had no idea what I was going to do with my PhD. The only thing I wanted to do was not be drafted. And at 69, the war was still going on.
Sure.
In fact, it was big time.
It was very hot.
Until 1975, the fall of Saigon. So
that's when they were drafting people at all levels. They didn't care. They were just pulling people. They were drafting people into the Marine Corps at that point. They just needed bodies.
It was not a good time. And by the time I had gotten married after I left Berkeley to Donna, whom you know, and we had met in junior high school, but she was a year ahead of me, and so she went off to college at the University of Pacific while I was still in high school, and we sort of stayed in touch, mostly during the summers. I had no way to go visit her in Stockton. I didn't have a car, and she didn't have a car. And I knew she was dating the football team, so I didn't want to be over there and observe that. And so I just kept my fingers crossed, and she made it out of college without at least a long-term boyfriend. And I never dated at Berkeley. I had my neighbor, a woman, a young girl who was a neighbor in Glendale. Was my bowling partner, but that was about it. And so we got married in the summer of '65 and came up to Stanford. By that time, she had gotten us a 61 Pontiac Le Mans, and so we started driving that up, and it made it as far as about a little bit north of Santa Barbara, and then the whole transmission fell out on the road, and so we hitchhiked up here to Palo Alto and left the car on the side of the road, and never went back to get it. I didn't think it was worth anything, and
so your career aspiration-wise, didn't you go to work for an oil company, or
well, that came after that. So I had a dilemma. I didn't know what to do. So I left I got a Stanford post office box, and it informed the draft board that was how they could contact me, because before that I would get these things, having to show that I was still in school and registered and so forth, because they were after me every 3 months. I get something from them. And so we got a post office box, and we got on a plane and we flew to Belgium, and I figured I was just going to stay in Europe until this thing was over.
Wow.
So we bought a used VW, and we got there, and just as winter was approaching, it was friggin' cold, and so we just started driving south until we got to Greece. And then there was a program announced that if you got a job with a critical industry that served the war effort, you could get an exemption from the draft.
Wow. And
so it was hard in those days. There's no email, there's only pay phones, to try to land a job. So it was cumbersome, but I knew that I didn't, as a chemical engineer in those days, you either worked for a petrochemical company or you worked for an oil company. And most of them were located in New Jersey or Texas, and I didn't want to live in either of those places. But I did find the research arm of Marathon Oil. Marathon Oil is located it was a family-owned refining company in Findlay, Ohio. And they wanted to start a research division, but they figured they wouldn't attract very many people to Findlay, Ohio. I mean, there's this old saying that a huge F5 tornado tore through Findlay, Ohio, and caused $50 million in improvements. They decided to build this research center south of Denver in a town called Littleton.
Sure.
Now, Littleton High School didn't exist. In fact, there was nothing in Littleton. There was a tire company. Gates Tire had a manufacturing facility, and that was it. It was in the boondocks. It was on a hill, had a great view of the Rockies. So I got the job. They were so happy to have a Stanford PhD who would want to work for this little because everybody wanted to work for Shell or Exxon or Mobil, and they had these great research labs, which they no longer have, but they did in those days. And so we took our VW and we shipped it to New Orleans, because I said, where do you want to, we have to ship this thing somewhere to a port. And so we hadn't been to New Orleans, so we shipped it to New Orleans and then flew to Colorado, and I started working. And then when the car came, we flew down to New Orleans, and we had stupidly packed everything we had bought and all the little treasures and things in the car. And when we got there, the car had no tires, no windshield wipers, no steering wheel, no seats, and nothing was in it.
Sure.
It had been completely stripped. So we had to get that fixed. We drove it back to Colorado, and I had been working there for about 3 months, and I hated it. I hated the job. I didn't respect the people around me. I was working on what I thought were kind of goofy projects. And I told Donna, I said, this isn't going to last. This is not going to work. And she says, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to go to medical school. So we would trudge up to the University of Colorado Medical School library, which was in Denver. It's not in Boulder, it's in Denver. And I just started reading physiology textbooks, anatomy textbooks, anything I could get my hands on so that I could take the MCAT test.
Yeah, sure.
So I took it and got into University of Colorado Medical School. And just at that time, you talk about coincidences, I had gone to American Institute of Chemical Engineering meeting to give a paper on my thesis. It was kind of an obligatory thing that you would do. And it was in Washington, D.C. And Dave Mason was there, and he came up to me and he said, grapevine has it that things didn't go real well in your job at Marathon. And I said, no, it wasn't exactly what I was looking for, and I didn't know what I was looking for. And I said, I'm going to become a doctor. And he said, we've been talking about future areas in chemical engineering. Now, mind you, this is 1969. And we think somehow biology is going to begin to play a role in the profession. None of us know how, because none of us know anything about biology, but since you've gotten into medical school, you must know a lot. Would you like to come back and join the faculty?
Oh.
And I go, what? I mean, this came completely out of the blue. And do what? And he says, well, start a program in bioengineering. Well, I had never had a formal class except in high school in biology or biochemistry or genetics or anything. And I had learned enough to pass this mindless test and get into med school. Because I figured I just have to find a job where I'm my own boss, because I didn't like reporting to people and I didn't like people telling me what to do. And so I said, what do I have to do? And he says, just, jot down a couple pages. In those days we had typewriters. Type out a couple pages of what you'd like to do. I had no idea. I'd probably be totally embarrassed if that letter still is in my record and I would have had to read it. But Dave Mason, who was not a giant in his field, but he was an incredible judge of people. And he was assembling a faculty that was shown to be essentially second to none.
Was that when Bud came in?
And they had hired Bud. I didn't know anything about that. They had hired Bud that year, and so I went home. I got home and I told Donna. I said, do you want to go back to California? And she says, well, yeah. She says, to do what? And I said, to be on the faculty at Stanford. And she goes, what? You've never ever said anything about being a professor on a faculty. I says, well, it never entered my mind until Dave Mason asked me. But I said, it's an option. And she says, well, what does it mean? I said, well, it means I have 7 years. There's a high likelihood I won't get tenure. And then I can go to medical school, or we'll think about what to do next. But I said, I think it's a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'd never taught, nothing. They just figured that this was an area that might blossom, and I might be a person that could enable that here at
Were you the only
Stanford.
one there at that time with somewhat of a background in biological sciences, having at least passed the MCAT? Were you the only one brought in?
The only one in the Chem-E department, and if you looked at the school, there was a biomechanics group in mechanical engineering. And they were mostly interested in, as you might expect, mechanics of, linkages and bone and hard tissue, and, but no one with chemistry or biology to speak of. And I had no idea what I was getting, myself into. I just knew what I wanted to get myself out of. And so we packed everything into our 65 Mustang, and we drove out here in the spring of 1970. I'd been given an acting assistant professor appointment starting July 1st, 1970. Dave Mason said, take it because the tenure clock won't start until October 1st or whenever it was, and to give you a chance to sort of get your feet grounded. And so we drove out in spring, and we parked out in front of Encina Hall, and I ran in there because I knew there was a card file. There was a housing office in there, and there was a card file of people in this area who rented to Stanford people. And they wouldn't advertise in the newspapers because they just wanted Stanford people. So I went in, and this lady, Lucille Long, was sitting at a big steel case desk, and she says, what are you looking for? I said, I'm looking for the file cabinet that has the listings. And she says, oh, that's not this office anymore. This is the faculty staff housing office. And I said, well, where is the card file? And she said, why are you asking? I said, well, I'm a new faculty member, and I need a place to live. And she looked at me, she says, well, you want to build. And I go, build what? And she says, you want to build a house. I said, you must be kidding. I said, I've got a 65 Mustang, and I've got $250 to my name. She says, that's enough. She says, $20 will get you a 99-year lease. And she reaches down, she pulled a stake out of her desk, and she handed it to me. And she says, go out there on the other side of Stanford Avenue where the old Ryan Power Lab is, and pound this in the ground where you want to live. We've put in the streets, but we don't have driveways in or anything. And write your name on it, and then come back and tell me where it is. And we'll give you $45,000. How old are you? I said, I'm 26. She says, well, 65 is the retirement age, which was the mandatory retirement age at the time. So that's 39-year mortgage. And I said, what's the monthly payment going to be? That's the only thing I can figure out. Sure. She says, well, it's going to be $219 a month for the next 39 years. And that was a lot, but it was about what a two-bedroom unfurnished apartment rented for close to campus in those days. So I went out, and the car's still running, and Donna, I'm holding the stake, and Donna says, well, what's going on? I said, we're going to go homestead. And we did. And I went back, and I said, how do you build a house? And she says, well, we have four builder architects you have to choose from. It's mandatory. So one is Dietz Crane, who sort of rubber stamps the same house up, but puts a colonial front or a western front or a Cape Cod front on it. There's Gerard, who does custom homes, very expensive. And there's Eichler.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's this guy, Bob Card. She says it like that. And I said, well, tell me about Bob Card. Who's he? He says, well, he's not an architect. And I don't think he went to school, but he's a builder. But you have to have plans. And I said, really? Give me his number. So we called him, and we couldn't hardly hear him because of all the traffic noise in the background. It turns out his office was a public phone booth on San Antonio Road. He sat there and waited for that public phone to ring. And
Well,
I said, can you build a house? He says, yeah, do you have plans? And I said, sort of. And Donna had cut out from Better Homes and Gardens and Sunset magazines all in her dream rooms and stuff. We'd put them in a brown paper envelope. We gave it to him. And he said, I can deal with that. And he came out with a team of guys, and he started building, and we still live in it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful house. I've been in that house. It's spectacular.
So when it was done, and it was Thanksgiving 1970, I just started teaching that fall, and Bob Card called up and says, your house is done. And we got there, and it was raining, cats and dogs. I don't know if you've ever been to the Mont Saint Michel, and
I have.
It's surrounded by water.
Right, sure.
Well, that's what our house looked like. It was completely surrounded by water. So I called them up, and I says, where's the front walk? How do we get to our house? It's like 3 feet off this moat. And he says, you didn't order a front walk. And I said, you didn't order? Doesn't that come with a house? And by the way, there's no driveway. He said, you didn't order a driveway. I said, doesn't that come with a house? He says, no, you got the house. And I said, well, put in a front walk. We can't get to the house. And he says, you have no money left. And he says, I have some wooden pallets. I'll come and dump them in this pond and build them up, and you can walk on them. So a year and a half, we walked in wooden pallets.
Your neighbors must have loved you. Or did you have any neighbors?
No, those houses hadn't been built. And there were probably 4 houses in that whole area, and it was a field, except for one oak tree. So it was, that's why they, in that spring, they had just opened up faculty housing to non-tenured professors.
Oh.
Before that, you had to be tenured. And the reason they did is because no one wanted to live there, because it looked to them like a wasteland. And there were horses wandering around on it. And of course, Page Mill Road was just a 2-lane road that wandered up into the hills, and the freeway wasn't there, and it was very pastoral and rural. No one went on the dish ever. There was just a little 3-wire fence to keep the cows in, and you could go up there with your dogs and run around, and nobody went there. Nobody went up there at all. And,
that's a great story about the housing. I'm sure you must have had neighbors who had similar things. But I want to come back to something you said. I talked with your colleague Kurt Frank, who was a faculty member in chemical engineering. It was a good question he asked, and I think you've talked about it. He wanted you to talk about the transformation of ChemE as a result of Dave Mason's vision. Hiring Andy and Michelle Boudard as senior anchors, then Bob Maddox, Bud Holmesy, and then you. And he thought it would be of value. You talked about what were those early days like, and what was the early teaching and research experience, and what were you trying to accomplish as a result when that department was coming together in this unique way?
Well, of course, when you're in it, you don't see it. I walked in and saw Bud Holmesy walking down the hall in Stauffer 3, and I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I've just been hired. And I said, so have I. And we were like deer in the headlights. And even though Dave was the chair of the department, Michelle and Andy were clearly having a strong imprint on how the department will ultimately, develop. And it became a point where Dave kind of served as an arbiter in this, because Andy and Michelle always didn't agree on things, and they were strong personalities.
Yes.
And so Michelle, so we went from essentially a department of like 3 people, and then when Michelle and Andy came, they each brought with them 2 graduate students for the faculty. So Michelle brought Bob Maddox, and Andy brought Doug Wild.
Oh, really?
And Doug Wild had worked with him at Berkeley. So now you have 4 new faculty.
Right.
And now you have the beginning of an insatiable demand for qualified graduate students.
Sure.
So that's how I got the phone call and came originally. And then you wind the clock forward from 65 to 70, and Bud and I are brought on the faculty. So we were the next hires. There had been one other hire, a fellow by the name of John Lind, who was a high-pressure chemist, and he didn't work out. He got kind of caught up in the war movement and just became kind of eclectic, and he was a very smart guy. I liked him a lot, but he just didn't work out. And then Bill Schwartz left and went to Johns Hopkins, where he had been, as a graduate student. So now we have Dave, and we have Doug and Andy and Michelle and Bob and Bud and myself. So, there were essentially 6 or 7 of us. Mm-hmm. So that was the kernel. And the first thing that Andy said to us, to Bud and to me, is that there's no decent applied math taught at this university. So we're going to teach an applied math class in chemical engineering, and I want the 2 of you to develop a 3-quarter series in applied graduate math, and classes begin in a week. That's how you had your hand held in those days.
Was there a reaction from the math department when they discovered you were teaching the math courses?
They didn't care. They didn't care about applied math. And as a graduate student, I had a class from Gordon Latta, who left Stanford. He was a very famous applied mathematician. I had 2 or 3 courses from him. And then I got my other math from Flugelotz in mechanical engineering, and from Bill Reynolds.
Oh, from Bill. Really?
Yeah, because they were teaching. Yeah. Everybody was teaching math in the guise of cloaked in something, but we just came out with an applied math course and called it that. But the math department wasn't just as computer science, when it was in H&S, didn't really care about computer science on the application side. It was all a bunch of theorists, right? And Forsyth and these guys, and so things were transforming all around us. And of course, we have this department where we're scattered all over the campus. And then Stauffer 3 got built.
Yes.
And that came years after Stauffers 1 and 2. Dave was very instrumental in getting the NSF funding that allowed us to build that. And we moved into that essentially it was just finished when I came in 1970. So that became my home, and then Bud was in there, Bob was in there.
Was it large enough for the entire faculty to be in there?
Doug was in there, yeah. And then what happened is we moved out of the what was called the annex, and they tore it down. This little building behind Old Chem.
Yes.
And they tore it down stone by stone because it was built out of this sandstone you can no longer get here. And that was put over in a pile by the Stanford Federal Credit Union, and then mined for repairs and to build walls and things over the years. And they just basically planted a lawn there and made that kind of a micro quad. Mm-hmm. This was before Gilbert was built.
Yes. And
so that's where Bud and I, started. So we were really the new kids on the block, and we got our first set of graduate students that year. So we didn't have graduate students actually working with us until a year after we got here, because you had to go through the application process, and we had to really work hard to get students to apply because nobody knew about us. Nobody knew about this department. It had no face value. Right. It had no reputation, other than Andy and Michelle were very, very highly thought of in their respective fields nationally. So this attracted a lot of attention when these 2 leave Berkeley, which was a blow to Berkeley, and come to a place where there's essentially a blank slate. And I think Andy and Michelle had such strength of character that they knew they wanted to create something, and they wanted to create it in a way that met their standards, which were exceedingly high. And they had started it with their 2 graduate students, and then with Bud and myself. And then we started the hiring of many of the faculty that you see here today. We've had a few faculty over the years that we've hired that have not acquired tenure. I think that's just is what happens. You don't, you think you make the right decision, but things just don't work out for a variety of reasons. Right. But if you look at the ones that have been here for a long time, I think Kurt was next. And Michelle actually found Kurt. He was at Sandia Labs in Albuquerque. He had gone to graduate school at the University of Illinois, worked with a guy named Westwater, a very famous fellow on the chemical sciences side of chemical engineering. And Kurt was doing excimer fluorescence chemistry, and I think what's really interesting about Michelle and Andy is I don't think they ever hired anybody expecting that they were going to do what they said they were going to do in the long run. I mean, I did bioengineering, but I did a particular kind. I mean, after all, recombinant DNA hadn't even happened when I was here. It didn't happen until '73. But I got two very good graduate students, one of whom went on to have a very distinguished career in chemical engineering at MIT and has written one of the best-selling textbooks in chemical engineering transport phenomena. And another who I've stayed in touch with all these years. In fact, I was just skiing with him in Montana 3 weeks ago. He's now retired from Sandia Labs in Livermore. He worked in the nuclear area. So we each got our first couple of graduate students, and we knew the clock was ticking, that we had 6 years to make a name for ourselves. And Andy and Michelle made it really pretty clear. They said, you need to establish in this period of time a national reputation in what it is you do, nothing less. And by the way, you have this full teaching load, and we're going to need help with graduate admissions and all the other things that go on.
Right.
We didn't know any different, and it was very exciting and very challenging, very time-consuming. I'm just amazed that my marriage held together during those years, because I literally was working probably 18-hour days.
Right.
And you have to realize that when we started teaching in 1970, we were using slide rules, math tables. There's no handheld calculators. There were these Marchant calculators, which were like old-time cash register machines. We had mimeographs. Xerox hadn't been invented. We had rotary dial telephones, and to telephone Washington, you'd dial 0 and you'd get a Stanford operator who would take the number down, and you'd hang up, and then within an hour or two later your phone would ring and they'd have a connection. I mean, and that's just the way it worked. Right. But it did work. And so I think with the very high standards that were set by Andy and Michelle, we went forward and began hiring, and so Kurt came on. And then I may get it out of order, but Jerry Fuller was a PhD student at Caltech, and he was working for one of my classmates who had come in that class of 65 to Stanford that Michelle and Akervos had recruited. So his name was Gary Leal, and we went through graduate school together. We shared an office with a desk. We both worked for Andy. And we kind of had this agreement that if you get a really special student, you let the other one know. Mm-hmm. And then Gary called up and he said, I've got this student, this Jerry Fuller. He's really quite spectacular, and you guys ought to take a look at him. We did, and we hired Jerry, still here. Yeah. Has had an amazing career. And then the others were very much serendipity. Stacy Bent was at NYU. Her husband had a very unfortunate accident. She was left as a single mother and 2 young kids, and she had gotten her PhD with Dick Zare here in chemistry. Mm-hmm. But she wanted to work in the area of surfaces and surface science, which Bob was pioneering. And so that was a good hire. I went to an AICHE meeting and heard a young Caltech graduate student giving a talk, and I was just completely amazed by what I heard. Turns out he was a student of Jay Bailey's, who was a very good friend of mine, sort of my age, and he was a prof at Caltech, and the student was Chetan Khosla.
Oh, really?
And I said, I've seen this guy,
Chayton,
so we need to. So we put the laser focus on Chayton, and we got him. So the department grew through surgical intervention of not just casting a net and seeing what fish you catch, but working really hard to identify talent before it was recognized by other people. And we seem to be really quite capable at doing that. And as a result, through the, Eric Schockfey, I admitted Eric to graduate school here at Stanford from Princeton. And he ended up working with Andy, and then he left and went to AT&T Bell Labs. And after that transition, we brought him back in because he was working in a different area of fluid mechanics, as was Jerry. And in a sense, as was I, although mine was very biomedical flavored, if you will. And so we have this thread from Andy that there's at least 3 of us in the department that, are his grandson or his son, if you want to, you want to look at it, academically. So he had a profound, impact on the department. And then our subsequent hires, our newer hires, have been done pretty much in the same way. We learn about people, we hear about people, and we observe them and watch them, and to some extent almost handpick them.
Can you go back to, I think you and Bud Holmesy had a chance to create Chem 20, Introduction to Chemical Engineering, which is highly regarded. I know well after the fact that you had a chance to put it on YouTube and Stanford iTunes, and hundreds of thousands of people have looked at it. What was that like, and what caused you to create that course, and what was the impact on it as you went forward with it?
So the other thing that Andy and Michelle, cooked up for Bud and me, because we were at the bottom of the food chain, was that we had no undergraduates in the major. We had maybe 2 or 3. We were like material science. And there was pressure by Pettit, who was the dean at the time, that departments in the School of Engineering should have a viable and robust graduate program. That's really where you earn your national reputation. But we do have an obligation to teach undergraduates, and effort should be put into doing that. The reward factor was de minimis from the standpoint of your reputation or your ability to get grants or fame or whatever, right. If you teach undergraduates. But our charter was you two have to figure out a way to develop an undergraduate program and decide, what courses are going to be taught and in what order and by whom, and we're all going to pitch into this, but you need to give us a blueprint. And so when Bud and I sat around, we said, well, how are we going to get people to major in chemical engineering? I mean, they don't know about us. It's scary. I mean, it's got chemistry and engineering. How bad can it get?
Yeah, we're going to scare a lot of people away from us.
We're not going to find anybody. And so we decided that in chemical engineering, there's always an introductory course called stoichiometry. And it's utterly mind-numbing. The textbooks are mind-numbing, the examples are mind-numbing, and the concepts are very, very important to how chemical engineers think about problem solving, but they were never put into the context of anything that was very interesting.
Right.
And so we knew we had to start out with an introductory course, and that we somehow had to teach this stoichiometry. And the question was, how can we thinly veil it or thickly veil it so that students really don't know that that's what they're learning? Right. And make it interesting for us who are teaching it and for the students. So we dreamt up, Chem 20, and the idea behind Chem 20 is we would teach it from a case, sort of a case point of view. That is, we would take a problem, and we'd solve it, and in the context of solving it, they'd learn certain principles that were having to do with stoichiometry, and then the problems would become more complicated. I mean, business school uses case study approach. Sure. And so we have 10 weeks, so we picked, I guess, 9 little units that appealed. I picked 4 or 5 that appealed to me, and he picked 4 or 5. So mine were, heavily slanted toward bio, and which I think students found interesting because they didn't come to engineering to learn about biology. They didn't even know they could. Right. And so in order to get the first group of students, we published a full-page ad in the Daily. And this was the year Star Wars had come out. Okay. And if you remember, the opening of Star Wars is it fades off into the distance.
That scroll.
The scroll.
Yeah.
So we went over to the Daily and talked to the typesetters. In those days, they didn't have computers. And I said, can you typeset something that looks like that? And we're going to call it Star Wars, and Bud and I are going to be the stars. And we had full body pictures of us, and he was Captain Safety, and I was Glitter Boy. And so we had these costumes, and we got photographs, and we published them, and he had a big hard hat with a cross on it, and was holding a sledgehammer or something, and I had some kind of like wild pre-disco suit on with sequins that Donna put together, and we said, you want to have a good time and learn about how much fun chemical engineering is? Show up in, it turned out to be Chem 20, which was the old major lecture hall in the old chemistry building, which is one of these old lecture halls that are very steep, and the students surround you almost like a medical, surgical lecture hall. And so we were teaching this applied math course, which was really keeping us busy because applied math, we knew it, but we had never had to really put a course together, and neither of us liked textbooks, so we had to invent our own syllabuses. And the same thing with Chem 20, never had a textbook, and in fact, I've never used a textbook. And
did the ad draw a lot of kids? Students show up?
It did. We had probably 40 or 50 show up the first time. I think some of them were just curious of what is going on.
These are faculty members just like this? What the hell is this?
And it was pretty extreme. And chemical engineering had gotten a little bit of a pop from Doug Wild. Doug was selected as the red hot prof. I don't know if you remember.
No.
So every year the students would select a prof called the red hot prof, which was somebody who taught a course that attracted a lot of attention. And Doug Wild was a very talented teacher.
Imaginative guy.
I mean, he always made a dull subject interesting.
Right.
I mean, how dull can linear programming be? But he can solve interesting problems. And so we kicked it off, and suddenly, when the course was over, we've had kids coming in saying, what's this major all about? And so he and I were the only advisors for the undergraduates for years, and we don't really want to push the major because you don't want to get a whole bunch of people in it that shouldn't be in it. But on the other hand, you found kids that were looking for something a little different, maybe the way I was looking to put together how things work with chemistry,
sure,
as opposed how things work with I-beams, or how things work with copper wires and circuits. And I think also the biology aspect, the first thing I would do was we would design an apheresis machine. I said, we're going to design a machine. It's the first thing you start out. So how many of you have ever designed a machine before? What? And give them enough material that they can actually design one, and then we'd all get on our bikes, and we'd go over to the VA hospital, and we'd go look at people that are on apheresis machines to see how they're actually working. And all these kids would come in, and I knew a lot of the docs over there, and they loved having students around. And later on, it got more complicated. We designed an artificial kidney in class, and then we'd march over there and look at the dialysis unit.
Neat.
And so I felt, because when I was in high school, what I really liked the most was when teachers showed us movies and when we went on field trips. The rest of the stuff I could do without. And because it was, interesting, like watching TV or something.
Right.
And so that was an experience we created, and we continued to. Well, the course is taught today.
Right.
It's been taught
it's been on
45 years.
And it's been looked at by hundreds of thousands of people because you put it out on YouTube.
Well, that's a different story, how that happened. What really happened was I announced that I was not going to teach E20 any longer, but had left Stanford by this time.
Oh.
So I was doing it, and I taught it occasionally. I would co-teach it. I co-taught it several times with Alice Gast.
Oh, sure, Alice, right.
And so there's another hire that came in. So Alice Gast worked with Bill Russell at Princeton University. Bill Russell was one of Andy's students here.
Oh.
And so as you know, she went on to be provost at not provost, but dean of research at MIT,
right.
and president of Lehigh,
right.
And now she's president of Imperial College in England.
Mm-hmm.
So she's had a very stellar career. Bud left and went to Santa Barbara to the mechanical engineering department, and then left them and went to the University of British Columbia, where he was in the math department, and has since retired and moved to Northern Washington State. But we're in email contact.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, after Bud left, we had E20, and E20 had grown to 150 students. Although the number of students we had in the major were generally running around 20 to 25 a year. So all those kids didn't become Chem-E majors, but they could use that as one of their technical electives.
That's right.
And there were one time called breadth.
The 20 course sequences. That's right. Yeah.
So they would come, and we. I really enjoyed teaching the class, but I got to the point where I was. I wanted to also start a intro class into biotechnology, because we didn't have anything here. And students' interest in bioengineering and biotechnology was steadily growing, and they were looking for ways to enter the field. And there were graduate courses splattered around. So I developed a course called E25, Introduction to Biotechnology, and started teaching that. And I had handed E20 off. I think Chaitan Casa was teaching it then, and started teaching that class. And then that became quite popular. It was getting in, over 100 students. And again, students could use that for a technical degree, technical requirement. And then the next thing that got to me was watching students in discussions. I could tell their understanding of energy was at best rudimentary, and I could see pockets of people saying, it's wind power, or it's coal, or it's oil, or it's natural gas, or it's fracking, or it's solar. And I could tell they had no context in which to make a lot of the statements they were making. I looked around, there was no intro course here at Stanford to, in a sense, provide a level playing field for students to make a reasonable assessment of their position in the context of energy transformation. And so I chatted with Stacy Bent about this, and I said, would you be willing to develop a course on energy, an intro course, and we'd co-teach it. But I was only going to do it for 3 years because I was committed at that time to retiring. And I said, you know, at the end of 3 years, you will have pretty much honed it, and you can take it over and do whatever you want with it. And she agreed. And so we put together, it was just an incredible, an exciting time. And Stacy's such a great person to work with, and very, very smart, to basically talk about how you compare solar thermal with solar electric, or oil with gas, or fracking, or wind, or water. How do you, what are the efficiencies? How do these efficiencies compare? What's the carbon footprint? What's the real estate footprint? How do you want to, you know, evaluate it? What's good? What's bad? And
do you use the same pedagogical approach as you did with Chem E20, or not, as a problem or a case style course?
No. We didn't, although the work that we asked them to do would be project work. So we'd ask them to do a comparison between, here's 3 electric cars that are on the market. How do they really compare?
Oh, yeah.
So they would get to the point where they could do something like that.
Right.
But it didn't yield itself to case studies as much as it did to say, okay, we're going to talk about, first of all, you have to get across the point that they don't produce energy, and energy's a constant in the universe. All you do is transform it from one form to another, which requires a little understanding of the first and second law of thermodynamics, and you have to do that in a way that they all don't run out the door. And but they need to know these principles. And then you take, okay, let's talk about, you know, nuclear, and then let's talk about wind and wind turbines, and then let's talk, you know, we talk about their efficiencies and what they produce and where they are, and we give them examples of where there are wind farms, and talk about their carbon footprints. I mean, for instance, you ask a student, what has a bigger carbon footprint, a nuclear power plant or a wind farm that produces the same number of megawatts? Oh, yeah, it's a nuclear power plant, because they hate nuclear. And so they'll just blame us. Sorry, it's actually the wind farm has a higher. Well, how can that be? I said, what do you think these little posts stick in? Enormous blobs of concrete. Do you have any idea how much carbon is produced in the atmosphere from all the concrete that's used to hold these things to keep the bending moment down from having them fall over? And then I, you know, a few sobering examples like that. You say, okay, what's the one that uses the least amount of real estate? Well, it turns out it's nuclear. And so if you're worried about real estate, what's the one that uses the most? It's biomass. I say, oh, well, we should grow corn and stuff. And then I talk about the ethanol myth and how that was all run politically by, you know, senators in Iowa. And,
right. And one of the subsidies.
It makes no sense. And we talk about subsidies. We talk about regulations. It was just a lot of fun to
So Stacy's taken that over.
Well, then 3 years was up, and I stayed to my word. And she says, I don't want to do this anymore either.
Oh, really?
So, and I also knew that there was a high probability she was going to be the next chair of the department. Because having been in the dean's office, right, for all that time, and watching the departments evolve. So we got Tom Jaramillo I don't know if you know.
No, I
So
don't.
Tom Jaramillo is a young prof, just got tenure. He had been, he's a Hispanic kid from Puerto Rico, and he had been an undergraduate advisee of mine in chemical engineering here at Stanford. So I have been, here's an example of this. Just watching this fellow go down to UC Santa Barbara, get his PhD, go to Norway and work with Jens Norskov, who we also hired into our department from Denmark as a senior hire, who now has collaborative programs with Slack. And Tom had done a section on batteries because he that's kind of what he does, and he was one of his roommates is the chief technical officer of Tesla, so we could get Tesla come in and talk, and of course students just loved that, and I would usually bring in somebody from one of the biofuel companies that I know in the area that would come in and talk about biofuels. I didn't try to taint their, I thought it was bad form to sort of bias them in their thinking. So I never let on that what I thought about biofuels or corn ethanol or solar thermal or solar. I just simply said, here's what it is, here's how you evaluate it, here's what it's producing now, and don't tell me that wind energy is free. I mean, what built that thing? Where'd all those resources come from? And one of the things you teach them is cradle to grave analysis. You really have to start with digging up the ore and then getting rid of the machine when you're done with it. And that's a big problem with nuclear plants. A third of the cost is in decommissioning a nuclear plant. So I got that out of my system, and then retired in 2013, and then immediately I got a call from Garth Saloner in the business school, the dean, and he says, we have this class called CAT, Critical Analytical Thinking, and would you be interested in teaching a couple sections in it? And I said, why me? I mean, you've got, and then I would complain. So you got a faculty that's, half our size, who get paid twice what we get paid. Make them do the work. And so he says, yeah, but they don't all get the substance, critical analytical thinking. And he says, I think, that goes to the scientific method. And so I said, well, I'm going to need some help. I'm going to have a co-conspirator with me. And he says, well, who? And I said, well, it's a guy who's a Stanford MBA. He runs he's a partner with three other guys in a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund and has a lot of experience in that. And, he says, that sounds good. I didn't tell him it was my son-in-law. And so for 3 years we taught that class up until last year. And then the business school decided to cancel the class for reasons I won't go into. But anyway, I really enjoyed teaching it, and then, as I said, I'm continuing to do the BioX seminar.
We've had a big leap from what you've done post-retirement. I want to go back to a section when you became chair, then became associated with the School of Engineering in the Dean's office, and then the development of BioX. Let me suggest we take a break here.